Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Mouthy Money podcast. I am joined as ever by my good colleague Chris Tuite, who is head of consumer finance at MRM. Chris, good morning and hello. And
Hi, Ed.
not such a fine day today, but hello. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I'm looking out the window here at the Shard, surrounded by grey clouds. So yeah, is the heat wave over? Might be.
I heard it was coming back, but I'm not sure. I think it also depends because I was getting press releases last Friday about the heat wave and like, oh, it's so hot at the moment, and actually it had already ended where we live, and I was kind of thinking about sending back a snotty email being like, wow, it's not, it's going for you in London,
Oh
but
yeah,
not
well,
for us.
it's always sunny in London, as you know, Ed. Apart from today, obviously, it takes time to get these releases signed off. A heat wave can come and go in the interim. That's the problem, isn't it?
So interestingly enough, actually, this is a little bit not the weather, but in terms of where I live is actually going to become the subject of the podcast because in kind of typical fashion, I have decided to bear all of my kind of personal goings on in my life for the podcast, and we're going to have a discussion today about a very specific thing, and that is moving house. So to kind of approach the subject from my point of view is that we have and I've put this on places like LinkedIn, so a few people might be aware of this, I don't know. We have a second child on the way, Chris.
Congratulations! Woohoo!
Thank you. Yeah. And I mean, I know you're fully aware of the implications of that because you have got two.
I
Is that
have.
right? Yeah.
I have two young daughters.
And the kind of the jeopardy, the additional jeopardy that having a second one potentially brings into a situation. So, I mean, this kind of involves explaining a little bit about my living circumstances and why we might be about to do something to change that. Basically, my wife Ellen and I, we live in the southwest. We live in Devon. More specifically, we live in North Devon. She's from Devon. She's from a town called Tavistock, and her parents still live there. Now, because we've got a second child on the way, the discussion has begun to arise as to whether we live close enough to the grandparents in order to receive that kind of easy support that, you know, having grandparents can provide. And they are both absolutely wonderful. They're really great with our son Cosmo. They look after him every other week, and you know, we get lots of help from already. The problem is though, they live a little bit further away than is perhaps easy, you know, for like a 20-minute kind of down the road sort of situation.
How far, Ed?
It's about an hour and 10 minutes drive from
I mean,
where
that's quite
where we
hefty.
live. You know, yeah.
Even by London commute standards, that's quite hefty.
Yeah, and it's not like, and the other thing that makes it slightly annoying is the way that Devon. This is a very geographical chat, but the way that Devon is designed is it's all the motorways are heading to Cornwall, so it's all kind of east-west. We have to travel north-south, and you end up on kind of roads where you're kind of trundling behind a tractor for half the journey, basically. It's just very Devon, north to south, and it just makes it's a bit of an annoying drive. Basically, it's not like you just get on the motorway and just forget about it. So that's our situation. So the conversation we are having now is, well, could we move closer to them? Now, the big problem that we have is that Ellen's job is in North Devon and she likes her job. She doesn't want to leave it. Obviously, I work remotely and I come into London. Kind of doesn't really matter where we are, where I am, sorry, but it does matter where she is. Now, interestingly enough, there's kind of a part of the world. Basically, we need to fulfill two requirements. We need to be able to be within a kind of 20-minute-ish drive of her parents, and we need to be within an hour for her to commute because she doesn't do it every day necessarily, but you know, an hour's drive kind of is acceptable. She's a community nurse, so she works all over the countryside as well anyway, so she's happy to stomach that. This gives us a choice of about two villages in central Devon to pick from. So that aside, and I appreciate this is very heavily me explaining out my situation here, but basically this is throwing up a conundrum of we've got a 5-year mortgage on the property that we currently live in, so I now need to take stock of what our house is worth, what we would need to do in order to get a mortgage on a new house and go through that entire process. And it started to concern me that the things are a little bit trickier than I would perhaps like. And this is
So,
kind of...
when
Yeah,
did you
go
buy
on.
the property, Ed? Sorry.
Yeah, so this is kind of what this discussion is going to be about today, and we're going to move on to look a bit more broadly on the property market. And actually, in a subsequent episode next week, we're going to dig into more detail, aren't we, Chris, on what's going on in the property market and some of the issues that people are beginning to face and things that are starting to feed through the system. But for now, the personal story, and to your question, we bought our house in July 2022. right at the top of the market. And it was right at the top of the market when people were moving out to the southwest, getting out of London, doing exactly what we did, getting out of London,
The race
you
for
know,
space, it was termed at the time, right? This is all the
yeah,
COVID stuff. Everyone was tired of their postage stamp back gardens in big
absolutely. Yeah.
cities. Yeah,
And we
right.
were like, I mean, type A for that situation. We lived in a small flat in Balham in South London. We wanted to get married. We wanted to start a family. We wanted to own a home. So it was, okay, let's get out to Devon. That's where the grandparents are. We can be close to them. We start a family, have their support. In actual fact, what happened was Ellen couldn't get a job in like Plymouth or Exeter, which is kind of would have been an easy commute for her from Tavistock, but she could find a job in North Devon, so that's how we ended up in North Devon. And now we're kind of we're now 3 years down the line here. This has left us with the conundrum. Actually, we do want to get closer to Tavistock to be close to grandparents, but she's willing to accept a bit more of a commute in order to be able to kind of achieve that. So the problem we now have is this: we're 3 years into a 5-year fix, and it was a very good 5-year fix, and I don't want to have to remortgage out of that or anything like that, because I don't want to have to go into a higher rate. We still have a couple of years left on it, so if we go now, we've still got a couple of years on that kind of nice rate before whatever happens in 2027. So, and this is something I had absolutely no idea about how this works, because obviously I've never moved home before while owning a home. I've moved while being a renter. That's kind of, you're in and out and you find somewhere new, whatever. But you have to kind of start digging into the terms and conditions of what your mortgage looked like. Now, the first thing I had to do is look at whether we could do something called porting our mortgage. So that basically means that when we sell this house, we get, whatever it's worth. And then basically we just put the mortgage onto the new property. So that money then just goes to the person who we're paying for the new property. And then the kind of mortgage just, ticks over. And there's like a fee of like £150 or something like that in order to kind of do the admin for them, etc. So that works, and we can do that, and I'm quite grateful we can do that, because early repayment fee is something like £7,500 or something absolutely terrifying. So, and some mortgages you can't port. Unfortunately, we're with a provider, Coventry Building Society, which for the most part you can do that. So that's good.
So I have done that, Ed, without interrupting your
Oh yeah.
conversation. When we moved into our current place, we had a good rate on our flat, which was only down the road in North London. So we took that half of the deal with us because it was good, and then got a second mortgage, if you like, not a second charge. It was all part of the first charge because it was done with the same provider, who was Santander at the time. But they just lent us some more money at a different rate. So what we had was two different loans charging two different rates. It's only now that we've managed to kind of align the two.
Yeah.
Because one mortgage had 1 year left to run, the other had 2 years left to run, and all this kind of weird stuff. So it was very helpful at the time, because it meant there was less faffing around in terms of proving affordability and starting from the beginning and all that kind of good stuff.
Yeah.
The rate was good, so we had to stick with the original provider, but it did present this other the other side of it was that it took a little bit more mental gymnastics to work out exactly what we were paying.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So this is what's created the issue for us is two things. The first issue is that obviously rates are higher now than where they were when we bought the house. So they were we got our mortgage for 2.99, I think it was, which is a great rate. We'd be looking at the best part of 1.5 percentage points higher if we wanted to get additional mortgage to buy a new property. So I'm kind of reluctant to do that at the moment, and we don't really want to have to spend more of our income on mortgage kind of thing. Especially with kind of another child on the way, and the potential that Ellen might have more kind of commuting costs and that kind of thing as well. And then this is where things get really, really strange. Well, not strange, but complicated and problematic for us. And that is the property market in the Southwest, in Devon specifically, and where we are, because obviously these are generalizations, is basically in kind of correction territory. So I'll lay out the cards on the table. We paid £285,000 for our house, which was right at the top of the market in 2022. And the kind of thing with the property market is like, it doesn't really matter if you then just sit on that property for 20 years, because the value of the property is not going to look anything like that, after 20 years. But the thing is, we've only been here 3 years and we now want to move. And in that time, and this is according to the Zoopla instant valuation. So obviously we haven't had an estate agent come around yet and look at it, but on the basis of the Zoopla evaluation, they think that we'd get about £270,000 for the house at the moment. So we've lost about 15 grand out of the value of the property, which is about 6% or something like that down, which is quite a lot. And it creates a problem for us, because it means that, so with our ported mortgage, we can get an additional 5 grand from the mortgage provider without having to go through any kind of, reevaluation process. But anything beyond that, we'd have to do what you guys did, which is get that additional, loan on top to buy. And as I said, we don't really want to do that. So the problem we've got is that we can only, unless we have other cash set aside in order to pay for a more valuable house, we've only really got, if we sell this house for 270 grand, let's say, we've only got £275,000 to play with. That means that we're able to afford less now than we were three years ago. And added to that, the area that we're having to look in, the relative value of properties is higher because it's a bit more of a desirable area, because it's kind of, there's better connections and that kind of thing down there in that area. So that's, yeah, it's created something of a problem for us, which I'm not sure if we're necessarily easily going to resolve without having to take more money out. And this is kind of, this is what we're wondering now is, what do we kind of thing? How do we resolve that? And I think this is also feeding into the wider kind of looking at what's going on in the market and wondering, is there a bit of a problem going on here more broadly? And why is there a problem, and what's kind of feeding into that?
So there was a correction in 23-24, right? So we had, those of you who remember, we had the sort of the Liz Truss mini budget fallout, which spiked a load of, despite the interest rates. Essentially, that was the end game of it. There was a lot around it, as we know, but that rapid interest rate hikes post COVID as well, and the cost of living crisis, that inflationary thing spiked everything and made mortgage borrowing more expensive, and that led to a sort of 5%, 10% nominal fall in some areas. Some were falling greater in real terms than others. So is this just a long tail of that, or is this something else, Ed? What do we think?
Yeah, I mean, looking at the Zoopla data for our own property, it's kind of progressively tracked downwards from the point at which we purchased it. It hasn't just like fallen off a cliff or anything like that. It's just kind of steadily declined. I think what's really interesting with this is potentially a positive story for buyers who are not on the ladder, because wages have been going up, prices have been at best flat, in many cases where we are, for example, falling. And this means that affordability levels are getting better. That being said, mortgages are obviously still more highly priced than they were 3 years ago. So you are kind of having to balance that out. But I think if I think there's kind of two things going on where we are. The first is that the demand has come off, and you can see what's really interesting is there's not really many properties coming on the market still, which is the same as it was in 2022, but that's more suggestive now that people are kind of sitting on their hands trying to wait and see whether the market will kind of come back to life. But yeah, the indication is that kind of there's something wrong in the market at the moment where we are. And that's not necessarily going to correct itself. Now, I think there is something to be said. If you're a home mover in this situation, you have been able to save a little bit of money alongside building up the mortgage, because that means that potentially, so let's say, okay, we bought our house for 285 and it's down 6%. But if there's somebody paid 350 grand for a property that's now down 6%, 6% discount on a 350 grand property is bigger than a 6% discount on 285. So basically, if in our position, if we have a bit of extra cash, then potentially there's some bargains out there to be picked up now, kind of thing. And I think I've spent a bit of time now looking at things like Rightmove and Zoopla and watching the market, and stuff comes on and it just sits for ages. And I find the thing that I find really funny is the first thing that tends to happen is the property will sit on there for ages, then it'll disappear. You think, okay, maybe it's sold, and then it will reappear with a different estate agent. So obviously, some poor person has sat for months not selling it, thought, oh, my estate agent is terrible, taken the listing off and come back with a new agent. And then you'll see 2-3 months later, the prices start getting knocked down. And I wonder if there's a bit of realism starting to feed into the market, because we are seeing price reductions start to come through, which I think is interesting.
So we still have sort of fundamentally a lack of supply, but obviously, the government have tried to address that with these new build targets, which suggest the sort of really long-term view, zoom right out over a period of years, is that house prices as an asset should really, I mean, there'll be changes and falls depending on individual local circumstances, but that scarcity creates, and the demand is still there because of the culture of home ownership in this country. So it'll end up with hopefully property prices won't collapse too far is kind of the general received wisdom. I think we've got some current factors at the moment which are making softening on demand or creating issues around demand, like borrowing still expensive relative to how it's been in the past. We've got a flat economy heading towards a downturn. Which it's been flat for 10 years or longer, as we sort of said before, but actually we're starting to feel the pain of that now with all the kind of various shocks that have happened along the way, and stimulus has limited the impact of it, things like quantitative easing and all that kind of stuff down the years. But actually where we've ended up now is maybe this is coming home to roost a little bit, where people just feel less well off and less willing to speculate on these things and less able to get the money to kind of keep this asset price bubble going in some ways. So it's quite interesting that those kind of fundamental aspects of the market are like that, and therefore you wouldn't necessarily think that that's particularly surprising. I think one corollary to this, if I may, Ed, is I've been talking to people here about prime central London property prices, friends of mine, things like that, who sort of are lucky enough to have property in what you call prime central London area. Interestingly enough, John Stepek wrote a really interesting piece on Bloomberg about this as well, but essentially we've been seeing now for a while, since its peak in 2015, a similar thing happening in prime central London, with property prices kind of falling in terminal decline. I saw it described somewhere, where it's all starting to kind of come right down. One of the many reasons cited for that is the Brexit thing. So London's become less of an international property place. We've got, like what we said, higher borrowing costs. We've got less international money coming in. We've got, a lot less Russian money coming in, for example. And London isn't seen as that much of an attractive destination for investing in property, prime central London property. And so we've seen major reductions there, which sort of echoes a bit in terms of what you're saying, which is people getting a bit more realistic about what the future of London will be. And I just wonder how people always say that, property price crashes are often preceded by prime central London underperforming and property prices falling there. Are we in a silent property crash at the moment, do you think? Not many people talking about it. Is that what you're feeling where you are? What's your take on that?
It really does feel, where we are, it really does feel like there is, if not a correction, if not a crash, sorry, there is a correction taking place where sellers are having to start to get real about what their homes are worth, and the fact, for me, I think, I don't know if there's too many estate agents kind of still just trying to push a higher price that's still just unrealistic, or whether it's the sellers who are being very sticky about that. I haven't really been able to dig into that very much. I think part of the issue as well is that it's so dysfunctional, the market, because if you look at even kind of, because one of the other things that we kind of thought about doing was, well, maybe we could sell where we are now and actually just rent for a few months and just get and just basically take a pause on it. But we didn't want to do that because we don't want to lose our decent rate that we've got. But actually, if you look at places like the rental market, it's even worse than the buying and selling market, because there's just no properties. Like there's an enormous amount of dysfunction, basically, driving, and I think part of the issue as well, and this is something which I'd be kind of keen to look more at, and I think we are going to dig more into it in a later episode, is actually with some of the Zoopla data. Part of the issue, I wonder, is there an issue where a lack of data is telling us strange things? So what I mean by that is there's not a lot of transactions happening. The market is very turgid. Things aren't really, moving. And that can, it's like when we have a stock market in the summer and everything goes a little bit haywire and it looks a bit crazy and volatile. And actually, we talk about these kind of, feverish stock market moves in the summer months, but actually if you dig underneath it, what's happening is most of the people who buy and sell in the stock market have gone on their summer break to Saint-Tropez, and what you're looking at in terms of price action is actually just a very small number of people making things move around. So it's that kind of, are we looking at the data in the wrong way? Because actually the data doesn't work probably because there's not enough of a sample size, because so few properties are moving. That in and of itself is a big problem.
Yeah, I was going to say, that in itself is an interesting data point, is the lack of transactions. That tells us something, doesn't it? But yeah, it's interesting on the Zoopla stuff, because, I've worked with the company in the past, and the use of automated valuation models is one of the things without getting too technical. So they do kind of rely on feeding in lots of smart data and very clever algorithms and all that kind of good stuff. But it does rely on that data being fed in, like you said. And if there is, in certain areas, a lack of movement, then, it might be that you have to kind of consider that factor as well as looking at those numbers. That said, every month I get my email and I open it up and I have a look at what it's saying, because it's as good an indicator as any out there for me to have a, track what's going on.
For like an armchair homo, who just wants to have a very vague, indication of what their property price is doing. There's nothing better than opening that Super email on a monthly basis. I think what's really interesting when you're actually, for me, like the experience now, actually, I'm actually going to become a home seller. And I remember being told this by, I think it was somebody told me about this, about the property market. One of the biggest problems for companies that try to do selling homes on a national basis, one of the biggest issues is that the property market is actually hyper localized, and actually estate agents that do really well, they really focus on their ground game in specific areas and knowing what's making those specific areas move. And actually, if you live in an area and you see one particular estate agent with lots of sold signs, it's probably a good idea to go with them, because they probably know they're tapped into buyers in the area, and so they're tapped into what the local dynamics are. And what I find interesting in the town we live in is buy and sell sign, selling signs go up with regular frequency where we are. And what's weird is I'm not looking at Rightmove moving our area, because we're moving area, so I don't actually have a great sense of it online, what's going on in the market in our area. But when you go around town, I can see one out my window now across the street. There's a house that's been sold across the street from us, and it didn't stay on the market for that long. Which to me says, okay, well, maybe there is a bit of life in the market where we are, and maybe that's not so. Maybe we might actually be all right. We might beat the expectations, because that's the Zoopla thing, right? Isn't it? They give you, actually what they do is they give you a range, and what the number that they give you is the one that they have the highest confidence on, but that's the middle of the range kind of thing. So actually, we could still sell our house for more if we get an estate agent who's on the ball and has buyers coming through the door kind of thing. So it's kind of it feels a little bit like all to play for, without wishing to use too much of a sporting analogy. But yeah, I mean, I'm quite nervous about it, but I also think, we do, having this, when we come back to it time and again, having that kind of plan in place for what we want to do and why it makes sense for us, and the compromises that ultimately we might be willing to accept in order to achieve that, I think it matter what matter most here to us.
Yeah, definitely. I think having that plan and having that idea of what variables you might need to accept, we're hoping to move quicker in the moment when opportunities arise. So that's a good thing. And thinking about this stuff is important in that kind of level of detail before you start getting into the midst of it, when it becomes more emotional. And, you can't predict what's going to happen, but having an idea of what might happen or scenarios that could play out is only going to be helpful, right?
I know, and I think something we're going to talk about in a future episode as well is actually one of the biggest issues underpinning the housing market, and the reason why the government and Bank of England might end up ultimately intervening to get things moving again is because so many people have so much of their net worth in their value of their property, and that is quite a big problem. And I think the thing for me is I don't look at my house as part of my wealth, really. I look at my house as something I'm living in. A mortgage is something that I have as a tool in order to not have a landlord, and the benefit of any kind of value in my property that we see over time growing is a bonus for us. And my long-term focus for where I want my retirement to be paid from is going to be my pension and ISA ultimately, and the home that we have is just something that we live in. And the fact that actually in retirement, it means that by having a mortgage, having paid that down, it means that I don't have that cost in retirement to have to worry about. And that's what kind of matters to me in terms of owning a home ultimately. And actually for me, and my wife will kind of confirm this, is actually owning a home was for me a non-negotiable when it came to having children. I didn't want to be renting with kids. I just didn't want to be in that living situation. And I know there's so many people out there who are not fortunate enough to be able to make that choice, and we were. But I kind of just like, I don't want to have the threat of a landlord over me when I have children. I want to be able to have that stability of a home. And actually, frankly, we've got a dog, and I don't want, it's a crapshoot looking for somewhere to take a dog in a rental accommodation.
Yeah, that's definitely a bit of a sticking point in pets and all that kind of good stuff. I think you're not typical there, Ed, with your view on what the home should be. I mean, talking about my own situation, obviously I bought in London, North London, and similar to you, get the Zoopla emails, and on the whole, the lowest estimate is still sort of above what we paid 4 odd years ago, 5 years ago now. The upper estimate is kind of, oh, okay, that's not bad. And then the middle one is, acceptable kind of thing. The last one I did open up said it was down 1%, but it had gone up 2% the month before. So it feels like we're kind of bumping along at this kind of level. And not building up huge amounts of equity other than sort of the month-on-month grind of building up the equity by paying down the mortgage, essentially. Higher mortgage rates have curtailed how much we can do with that. So I am looking at the idea of overpaying slightly. And that feeds into my retirement situation as well, because I'd actually be past the retirement age when my mortgage term expires. So I want to try and kind of pull that down. But I am worried about a crash because of this prime central London thing, because it's an expensive asset. And, take the point about the security, and it's the same way our sort of thought process was with it. I want to be kind of our own bosses with regards to that. But, the insecurity brought about by not being able to meet mortgage repayments is something that's kind of been on my mind. And we don't get me wrong, but what if the situation changes? We've seen rapid rises and we haven't seen an end to kind of instability. So I've been looking at historic crashes in the UK and wondering whether or not this canary down the mine in prime central London is something that we should be worried about. And it's interesting because historically there are sort of four main house price movements in the last 60 odd years. The first one between 1973 and 1977 was very similar to today in some ways. There was an oil crisis, high inflation, and then an economic recession that followed. And UK house prices fell by almost like over a third in real terms if you adjust that for inflation. And actually the prime central London canary down the mine checked out for that. So they started to slow and fall before the wider UK prices dropped. And that was due to the international nature of it. Obviously, prime central London's always had people coming in and moving around, and it makes it more sensitive to macroeconomic shocks and capital moving in and out more flightily. And that's always kind of been one of the perks, I suppose, of London for people who have capital, but also one of the drawbacks when things turn a bit sour. The 89 to 95 crash was caused by massive spike in interest rates and sort of the end of the housing boom, I suppose, and then obviously a recession off the back of that, and that was really painful. So there was a 20% nominal fall, but actually that's many argue that was between 30 and 40% in real terms. And again, prime central London became the canary down the mine. It peaked earlier than the national average in 88, and then the declines were first noticed in the higher end boroughs, so Kensington and Chelsea and Westminster, and then it rippled out. Other things I'm concerned about, living on the edge of those ripples, if you like, towards the out parts of the city into zone 4. But then more recent ones suggest something slightly different. So we had the global financial crisis and the credit crunch in 2008, 2009. There was a sort of 20% in real terms fall, and there was a softening in prime central London prices in 2007, but then the crash became sudden and widespread because there was a credit crunch, right? And we all kind of felt that immediately. And then actually prime central London bounced back. And I think there was still this notion, and this is maybe what's slightly different about this one, that the UK was still an international destination, that London was still a, well-connected in the EU place for capital and a place for businesses to come and do business. And what we've seen over the last 17, 18 years has been a retrenchment from that. So we've seen obviously Brexit happen, which has made things slightly stickier. We've seen a change in the geopolitical situation, which means less foreign money coming in, and we've seen the economy stagnate over that time. And so I don't know where I fall with this one. We've obviously had a correction we mentioned with the increase in mortgage funding, and I'm wondering, is that a precursor to a wider fall that might be felt throughout the rest of the country, an earthquake in prime central London that kind of ripples out to everywhere?
Yeah.
Or is it, like you said, this kind of hyper-local thing where actually people will still want to live in London, maybe the race for space is over, and people will start dripping back into the cities, which might keep more affordable property prices where I live, in relative terms, more buoyant. It's an interesting dynamic. Where do we go on this? What does history tell us? It's quite an interesting
So I'm gonna leave the listeners on a bit of a cliffhanger here, because I think we're in danger of doing the next podcast episode. What we're going to look at next week is we're going to look at all of this kind of, hearsay, boots on the ground kind of discussion about what's going on with the property market. And, we've kind of looked at my personal experience of what's going on where we are. Obviously you've got a different situation again. we're going to look at the question more specifically. Is the UK property market about to crash? Is it actually crashing now? Are we in a correction? What is actually going on out there? And I think from that question, they will look at what are the implications for buyers? What are the implications for people who are sitting on property wealth and potentially need to do something with that property wealth? And then I think we'll also look at what is the government going to do about it, if anything? What is the Bank of England going to do about it? Because they have a big say in this as well. And I think we're going to try and unpick some of these issues and really get to grips with whether or not we're facing some sort of, real, call it what it is, a crash. Are we going to face a crash? So I think we have to leave my personal situation on a bit of a cliffhanger too, because we have to decide what's going to happen next.
We'll come back to it, won't we, Ed?
We'll come back to it. I will say for now, actually, I don't think we're going to be moving before before our second arrives. The babies are only due in December, so actually this is probably going to be for us end up being a 2026 story. But the point is this is such a big, and property transactions, buying a home, selling a home, it's one of the kind of biggest things you'll do in your life as financial transactions go. So actually, for me, I am thinking about this now on a 6 to 9 month horizon on what's going on, what we need to do. And actually the practical considerations as well of that are, I've got to repaint the house. I've got to make the wood floors downstairs look like they're not, run around on by toddlers and dogs all day long kind of thing. Just all those kind of little things that mean that estate agent isn't going to come around and go, oh, I'm sorry, mate, this place is a complete disaster. You're just going to have to burn it down and get the insurance money kind of thing.
Which we don't advocate on
No,
Mouthy
absolutely
Money.
not. Never do that. That's terrible. But you know what I mean? It's kind of like, because we've lived in it for 3 years, and we've made 3 years worth of living in it damage kind of thing to the house. Yeah. We've made some things a little bit better, and we've unpicked some problems that the last seller left us with. But, that journey's not going to be even. It's going to cost us money and that kind of thing. So, yeah, I think my next step is now we're going to get the estate agents in, do a beauty parade, so to speak, get some valuations, get some tips on what they think we need to do in order to shore up that price and that kind of thing.
More data. Good idea.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the most valuable things in commodities in the world is information at the end of the day, isn't it? And knowing what we know. So that's it. I think as I said, we'll be back next week with more talk of a property crash.
Potential property crash.
What's going on out there, etc. So please do give us a subscribe just to follow for the next episode. With that, Chris, thank you for being a good listener today. I think I've done quite a lot of the talking.
No, my pleasure. So it's all very interesting. And congratulations again on your new arrival.
Thank you. And thank you everybody for tuning in. As I say, do come back. We'll be digging even deeper into this topic very soon. So with that, I should say goodbye. Goodbye, Chris.
See you later.
And bye-bye. See you all soon.
Don't forget to subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or YouTube. You can also follow all our latest updates on TikTok, Instagram, or X. Finally, check out all our money stories on the Mouthy Money website and subscribe to our weekly newsletter for all the latest straight to your inbox. Thank you and goodbye.